The biting November wind whipped around the obsidian monolith of Blackwood Tower, a structure that scraped the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. Much like its owner, Arthur Blackwood, clawed his way to the apex of the financial world. Arthur stood, not at the panoramic window of his penthouse office as one might expect, but on the surprisingly grimy sidewalk, the collar of his bespoke cashmere coat turned up against the chill that had little to do with the weather and more to do with the hollow echo in his chest. He'd just endured a 3-hour board meeting, a verbal wrestling match where he'd pinned his opponents with cold logic and colder threats, securing a hostile takeover that would make headlines and enemies in equal measure. Victory tasted like ash, as it often did these days. His driver, a stoic man named Peterson, held the limousine door open, a silent invitation to return to the gilded cage of his existence. Arthur, however, felt an uncharacteristic urge to walk, to feel the city's gritty pulse beneath his handmade Italian leather shoes, perhaps to delay the inevitable return to the echoing silence of his sprawling, art-filled apartment, where masterpieces hung unseen and unappreciated by anyone but the cleaning staff. He waved Peterson off, a curt gesture. "I'll walk a few blocks, Peterson. Pick me up at the corner of 5th and Elm in 30 minutes. Peterson nodded, his expression impassive, though a flicker of surprise might have crossed his eyes had Arthur been looking. It was unusual, this deviation from routine. Arthur Blackwood was a man sculpted by ambition and loss, though the latter was a carefully guarded secret, buried deep beneath layers of success and cynicism. At 58, his dark hair was threaded with distinguished silver at the temples, his face etched with lines that spoke more of boardroom battles than laughter. He was a titan of industry, a name whispered with awe and fear, a millionaire many times over. Yet the vast fortune he commanded felt more like insulation than comfort, separating him from the raw, messy vitality of genuine human connection. His early life had been a relentless climb, spurred by a domineering father who valued profit above all else, including his son's youthful dreams of becoming an architect, or his tender, almost forgotten romance with Eleanor. Eleanor, with her bright laugh and eyes that saw past the burgeoning businessman to the hesitant artist within. His father had crushed that relationship with ruthless efficiency, deeming her unsuitable, a distraction. Arthur, young and already conditioned to obey, had capitulated, burying his heart along with his drafting table. He never knew what became of Eleanor after he was packed off to a prestigious business school abroad. He'd tried to find her years later, when his father's grip had loosened with age and illness, but the trail had gone cold. It was a dull ache, a persistent phantom limb of what might have been. He walked, hands thrust deep into his pockets, the city's cacophony a stark contrast to the sterile quiet of his usual environments. The smell of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor warred with exhaust fumes, the blare of taxi horns punctuated by the distant wail of a siren. It was real, unfiltered, and for a moment, almost refreshing. He passed by storefronts glittering with early Christmas decorations, their forced cheer feeling almost offensive to his current mood. He was preoccupied, replaying the board meeting, dissecting the vulnerabilities of his adversaries, when a small voice cut through his thoughts. "Candy, sir?" "Just $1. He looked down. A little girl, no older than 7 or 8, stood beside a rickety folding table laden with a meager assortment of chocolate bars and lollipops. She was bundled in a pink coat that had seen better days, her nose red from the cold, her eyes, large and surprisingly serious, fixed on him. Her hair, the color of dark honey, escaped from under a knitted hat. Arthur, usually adept at sidestepping such encounters, found himself momentarily rooted. He wasn't unkind by nature, merely detached. These street vendors were part of the urban landscape, usually invisible to him. Today, however, something about her earnest gaze, the way she shivered slightly despite her coat, pricked at a layer of his carefully constructed indifference. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. It was an ostentatious piece of alligator leather, and he felt a sudden, inexplicable flush of self-consciousness as he extracted a $1 bill. It felt like an insultingly small sum compared to the millions he'd just been maneuvering. He handed it to her, intending to wave away the candy, a quick transaction to soothe a fleeting pang of something he didn't want to name. "Keep the change," he mumbled, already turning to leave, eager to escape the uncomfortable awareness of her small, hopeful face. The little girl took the dollar, her small, gloved fingers carefully smoothing the bill. She didn't immediately offer him a candy bar. Instead, she looked up at him, her head tilted, a peculiar expression dawning on her face, a mixture of awe, confusion, and a heartbreaking flicker of recognition. Arthur paused, mid-stride, a frown creasing his brow. What was this? He expected a quick "thank you," perhaps a shy smile, not this intense, unnerving scrutiny. The wind gusted again, swirling a few stray leaves around their feet. The sounds of the city seemed to recede, creating a strange, focused silence around them. He saw a woman, presumably her mother, hovering a few feet away, watching them with a wary expression, her arms crossed tightly against the cold. The girl's gaze didn't waver from his face. Then her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice clear despite its softness, 6 words that sliced through Arthur Blackwood's armor with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, words that stopped the world on its axis. "You look just like my dad," she said, her tone not accusatory, not even particularly questioning, but stated as a simple, profound fact. Arthur froze, every muscle in his body locked. The dollar bill fluttered from his suddenly nerveless fingers, landing unnoticed on the grimy pavement between them. The city's noise crashed back in, a deafening wave, but it couldn't penetrate the sudden, icy stillness that had enveloped him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He stared at the child, her innocent observational statement echoing in the vast empty chambers of his soul, unearthing ghosts he thought long buried. The takeover, the board meeting, the millions, all of it evaporated, leaving him standing on a cold street corner, utterly exposed, facing a past he had unknowingly been running from his entire life. The girl just watched him, her large, serious eyes holding his, completely unaware of the cataclysm she had just unleashed within the powerful, composed CEO. The world tilted. Arthur Blackwood, a man who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, a man who could stare down a hostile takeover or a market crash without blinking, felt the ground beneath his expensive shoes become treacherous and unstable. "You look just like my dad." The girl's voice, so small yet so potent, reverberated through him, striking a chord so deep and unexpected it left him breathless. His mind, usually a well-oiled machine of calculations and strategies, sputtered and stalled. He could only stare at her, this tiny oracle in a faded pink coat. Who was her dad? And why would she say that to him, a stranger? His first instinct, a defense mechanism honed over decades, was to dismiss it. A child's fancy, a coincidence. He was a man of a certain age, a certain build. Perhaps he simply resembled a generic father figure. But the way she'd said it, with such quiet conviction, and the sudden, sharp image of Eleanor that had flashed through his mind, Eleanor's eyes, her smile, a warmth he hadn't felt in 35 years, made dismissal impossible. A cold dread, mingled with an even colder, more terrifying hope, began to seep into his veins. He bent down slowly, his knees creaking in protest, and picked up the fallen dollar bill. His hand was trembling. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, searching her small face for something, a clue, a confirmation, a denial. Her eyes were a clear, intelligent hazel, framed by long, dark lashes. Her nose was small and slightly upturned. There was a stubborn set to her chin that seemed vaguely, disturbingly familiar. "What did you say, little one?" he managed, his voice raspy, unfamiliar to his own ears. He needed to hear it again to be sure. The girl, whose name he would later learn was Lily, didn't flinch from his intensity. "You look like my daddy," she repeated, a small frown now puckering her brow, as if wondering why this simple statement was causing such a profound reaction in the tall, imposing man before her. He had dark hair like yours, and his eyes smiled even when his mouth didn't." Arthur's breath hitched. Eleanor used to say that about his own rare smiles. A coincidence. It had to be. Before he could ask another question, the woman he'd noticed earlier stepped forward, her expression a mixture of concern and suspicion. She placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. "Lily, honey, don't bother the gentleman." Her voice was low, tired, but with an undercurrent of resilience. She looked at Arthur, her eyes scanning him from head to toe, taking in the expensive coat, the air of wealth and power that clung to him. "I'm sorry if she disturbed you, sir. She's just imaginative." Arthur straightened, trying to regain some semblance of composure, though his insides were a maelstrom of emotion. No disturbance at all," he said, his voice still strained. He wanted to ask the woman questions, demand answers, but her defensive posture, the way she drew Lily closer, told him he needed to tread carefully. He couldn't just interrogate them on a street corner. "She's a very observant little girl." He offered a weak, unconvincing smile. He fumbled in his wallet again, this time pulling out a $50 bill. "Please," he said, holding it out to the woman, "for the candy, and for your time." The woman, Sarah, looked at the money, then at Arthur, her suspicion deepening. "That's too much, sir. We can't accept that." Arthur felt a surge of frustration. He was used to getting what he wanted, to solving problems with money, but this wasn't a business negotiation. "Please," he insisted, his voice gaining a desperate edge he rarely revealed. "It's cold out. Perhaps buy yourselves a warm drink." He pressed the bill into her reluctant hand. Then, acting on an impulse he didn't understand, he turned back to Lily. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she whispered, still watching him with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "Lily," he repeated, the name feeling foreign yet significant on his tongue. He wanted to ask about her father, his name, what happened to him, but the mother's guarded stance was a clear barrier. He couldn't push, not now. He gave a curt nod, a poor imitation of his usual decisive self, and turned away, forcing himself to walk towards the corner where Peterson would be waiting. He didn't look back, afraid of what he might see, or what they might see in his own eyes. The remaining 20-odd minutes until Peterson was due felt like an eternity. He walked aimlessly, his mind racing. The encounter had shattered his afternoon, his week, perhaps his entire well-ordered life. Those 6 words. He replayed them, dissecting every nuance, every possible implication. Was it possible? After all these years? Could Eleanor have had his child? A child who grew up to have a daughter of her own? A granddaughter? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He, Arthur Blackwood, a grandfather. It seemed preposterous. And yet, the girl's certainty, the fleeting resemblance he thought he'd glimpsed, the echo of Eleanor. When Peterson finally pulled up, Arthur practically fell into the back seat of the limousine, a stark contrast to his usually composed entry. "Home, Peterson," he managed, his voice hollow. The rest of the day was a blur. He cancelled his evening engagements, a charity gala he'd been dreading anyway. He paced his opulent apartment, the city lights twinkling mockingly outside his floor-to-ceiling windows. He poured himself a brandy, then another, but the alcohol did little to soothe the turmoil inside him. The image of Lily's face, her serious eyes, her quiet pronouncement, was seared into his memory. He saw her in the abstract paintings on his walls, in the reflections in the polished surfaces of his expensive furniture. He hadn't felt this unmoored, this profoundly disturbed, since his youth, since Eleanor. The carefully constructed walls around his heart were crumbling, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to rebuild them. The silence of his apartment, usually a welcome respite, now felt oppressive, amplifying the questions that screamed in his mind. Who was Lily's father? And why? Why did she think he looked like Arthur Blackwood? The need to know became an obsession, a fire igniting in the cold embers of his soul. The night offered Arthur no solace. Sleep was a distant, unattainable shore, his mind a tempestuous sea of what-ifs and fragmented memories. Lily's face, her innocent yet earth-shattering words, played on a loop, each repetition chipping away at his hardened exterior. He saw Eleanor's smile in Lily's tentative one, a ghost of her warmth in the child's direct gaze. He replayed his last conversation with Eleanor, a scene his father had orchestrated with cruel precision. He remembered her tear-streaked face, her quiet dignity, even as he, a coward, had mumbled his father's dictated excuses. He'd told himself it was for her own good, that his world of ruthless ambition was no place for her gentle spirit. Now, decades later, the hollowness of that justification mocked him. Had he thrown away not only his own happiness, but also the chance to know his own child? The possibility was a physical ache, a crushing weight on his chest. By dawn, as the first pale light began to dilute the city's artificial glow, Arthur had made a decision. He could not let this go. He had to know the truth, whatever it might be. His usual morning routine, a brisk workout, a scan of the financial news, a meticulously planned breakfast, was abandoned. Instead, he found himself dialing the number of Michael Davies, a private investigator he'd used on rare occasions for discreet corporate intelligence. Davies was expensive, thorough, and, most importantly, utterly discreet. "Mr. Davies," Arthur said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion when the investigator answered, "I have a personal matter I need you to look into. It's of the utmost urgency and requires absolute confidentiality." He hesitated, the words feeling monumental. "I need you to find a little girl and her mother. The girl's name is Lily. She was selling candy yesterday afternoon on the corner of 6th Avenue and West 48th Street." He described Lily and her mother as best he could, the details surprisingly vivid in his mind. He omitted the crucial detail of what Lily had said, framing it as a sudden philanthropic interest. Davies, ever the professional, asked no prying questions, merely noting the details and promising to begin immediately. Hanging up, Arthur felt a strange mixture of anxiety and relief. The die was cast. He was setting in motion a search that could unravel his carefully curated life, or perhaps stitch together its frayed, forgotten pieces. The day stretched before him, an expanse of meetings and decisions that suddenly felt trivial. He went to his office, moving through the motions like an automaton. His sharp mind, usually so focused on profit margins and market shares, was elsewhere, replaying the encounter on the sidewalk, analyzing Lily's features, searching for a definitive link. He found himself staring out the window, not at the sprawling cityscape that represented his empire, but into the middle distance, lost in the labyrinth of his past. Flashbacks assailed him with renewed intensity. Eleanor, laughing as they picnicked in Central Park on a stolen afternoon, her hand warm in his. The fierce disapproval in his father's eyes when he'd discovered their clandestine meetings. The crushing weight of familial duty and ambition that had led him to sacrifice love for success. He remembered Eleanor telling him she felt unwell for a few weeks before their abrupt separation. a detail he'd dismissed at the time, preoccupied with his father's escalating pressure. Could she have been pregnant then? The thought was a spear through his heart. Why hadn't she told him? Or had she tried, and he, in his youthful arrogance and fear, had been too blind to see? The questions were a torment. He barked at his assistant, Grace, a kind, matronly woman who had been with him for over 20 years and was one of the few people who occasionally glimpsed the man beneath the CEO facade. She absorbed his uncharacteristic irritability with her usual calm, her perceptive eyes noting his distraction, his pallor. "Is everything all right, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked gently during a lull in his agitated pacing. Arthur almost snapped at her, but something in her quiet concern made him pause. He couldn't confide in her, not yet, but he found himself saying, "Just a restless night, Grace. Nothing more." She didn't press, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than usual. By late afternoon, Davies called. "Mr. Blackwood, I have some preliminary information." Arthur's heart leapt into his throat. He swiveled his chair away from his desk, facing the window, as if the city skyline could offer him fortitude. "Go on," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The girl's name is Lily Miller, 7 years old. She lives with her mother, Sarah Miller, in a small apartment in Queens. They appear to be struggling financially. Sarah Miller works part-time as a cleaner and sometimes sells candy or crafts with Lily to make ends meet. There's no record of a father currently in the picture." Davies paused, then continued. "According to neighbors, Lily's father, Daniel Miller, passed away just over a year ago. An accident at a construction site where he was doing some temporary labor. He was apparently a freelance artist, talented but unrecognized. Daniel Miller. The name meant nothing to Arthur. Yet. An artist, Arthur murmured, a strange echo of his own buried aspirations. The construction site accident sounded tragic, and a fresh wave of sympathy, sharper this time, washed over him for the little girl who had lost her father and was now selling candy on a cold street. "Do you have a photograph of Daniel Miller?" Arthur asked, the question almost a whisper. "Not yet, sir, but I'm working on it. These things take time, especially when trying to maintain discretion." "I understand," Arthur said, though his patience was wearing thin. "Find out everything you can about Daniel Miller, and about Sarah. I need to know their story." He hung up, the information churning in his mind. Lily's father was dead. This explained her referring to him in the past tense. It explained the sadness he'd glimpsed in her eyes. It did not, however, explain why she thought Arthur resembled him. The mystery deepened, and with it Arthur's inexplicable sense of being drawn into their lives, a pull that felt less like curiosity now and more like a nascent, terrifying responsibility. He spent the evening not in his usual solitary splendor, but sifting through old boxes he hadn't opened in decades, boxes his housekeeper had meticulously labeled and stored away. He was searching for ghosts, for a photograph of Eleanor, for anything that might connect the fragmented pieces of his past to the present predicament. He found a few faded letters, her familiar handwriting a jolt to his system, but no pictures of her. His father, in his campaign to erase Eleanor from Arthur's life, had likely destroyed any he possessed. The search was futile, yet it felt necessary, a penance for his past inaction. The image of Lily, so small and vulnerable, yet so direct, haunted his every thought. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to shield her from the harshness of a world that had already dealt her a cruel blow. This was new territory for Arthur Blackwood, a landscape of emotion he had long avoided, and he navigated it with the trepidation of a man walking through a minefield. Arthur knew he couldn't just wait for Davies to unearth more facts. The image of Lily selling candy in the biting cold, her mother's weary, protective stance, it gnawed at him. He felt an urgent, almost primal need to see them again, to offer help, though he was unsure how to do so without revealing his intense, almost obsessive interest. He couldn't simply march up to their apartment in Queens. That would be intrusive, alarming. His wealth, usually a tool to open any door, felt like a barrier here, something that would only heighten Sarah Miller's suspicion. He needed a pretext, a plausible reason for a man of his stature to involve himself in their lives. The solution came to him during another restless night, his dormant charitable foundation. Years ago, for tax purposes and a touch of public relations gloss, Blackwood Industries had established the Blackwood Foundation, a vaguely defined entity that made sporadic, impersonal donations to established charities. It was largely a paper exercise, managed by his CFO, with minimal input from Arthur himself. Now, he saw a new, deeply personal purpose for it. He called an emergency meeting with his CFO and legal team first thing in Zhenjiang Day. "We are redirecting the Blackwood Foundation's focus," he announced, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Effective immediately, we will be establishing a new initiative, the Brighter Futures Grant. It will provide support to families of artisans and creative individuals who have fallen on hard times, particularly those with young children who have lost a primary caregiver." His team exchanged surprised glances, but knew better than to question a directive delivered with such conviction. Arthur, usually detached from the Foundation's activities, was now micromanaging, pushing for rapid implementation, for a simple application process, for immediate outreach. He wanted it to appear organic, a genuine philanthropic endeavor, not a targeted operation. Within a few days, armed with a professionally designed brochure and a carefully crafted spiel about community support, Arthur drove himself to Queens. He dismissed Peterson for the day, feeling this was a journey he needed to make alone. The address Davies had provided led him to a modest, slightly run-down apartment building, a world away from his Manhattan skyscraper. He felt a knot of trepidation in his stomach. What if Sarah recognized him from the street encounter and slammed the door in his face? He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, a concession to habit he immediately regretted as too formal, and rang the bell for apartment 3B. The door opened a crack, held by a chain, and Sarah Miller's wary eyes peered out. She looked tired, her face pale, but her gaze was direct, assessing. "Yes?" "Mrs. Miller?" Arthur began, trying to sound approachable, a role he rarely played. "My name is Arthur Blackwood. I'm from the Blackwood Foundation. We're launching a new grant program called Brighter Futures to support families like yours, families of creative individuals. May I come in for a few minutes to explain?" Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Blackwood, like Blackwood Tower?" Arthur nodded, bracing for her reaction. "Yes, that's my company's foundation." He saw a flicker of understanding, perhaps connecting him to the wealthy man from the candy encounter, but also a deepening of her caution. "I'm not sure I understand," she said, her hand still firmly on the door. "It's a new initiative," Arthur pressed gently, trying to project sincerity. "We aim to provide financial assistance and support to help families get back on their feet. Someone mentioned your late husband, Daniel, was an artist." Her expression softened almost imperceptibly at the mention of Daniel. "Yes, he was," she said, a note of quiet pride in her voice. After a moment's hesitation, she unlatched the chain. "All right, you can come in, but I don't have much time." The apartment was small, but meticulously clean. Children's drawings were taped to the refrigerator, bright splashes of color in the otherwise subdued space. Lily was sitting at a small table in the corner, diligently coloring in a book. She looked up as Arthur entered, and her eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He offered her a small, tentative smile. Sarah gestured towards a worn sofa. Please sit." Arthur sat, feeling conspicuously large and out of place in the cosy, lived-in room. He explained the grant, keeping his language simple, avoiding corporate jargon. He emphasized that it was designed to honor the legacy of artists like Daniel by supporting their families. Sarah listened intently, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "And what do you want in return, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked when he finished, her voice skeptical. "Nothing," Arthur replied, meeting her gaze directly. "This isn't a loan, it's a grant. We just want to help. To provide some stability, perhaps help Lily with her education, or allow you some breathing room to find more permanent work." Lily had stopped coloring and was now watching him with that same unnerving, focused intensity she'd shown on the street. He felt her gaze like a physical presence. He tried to engage her. "That's a beautiful drawing, Lily," he said, nodding towards her coloring book. She shyly held it up, revealing a vibrant picture of a fantasy castle. "My daddy used to draw castles," she said softly, her eyes flicking towards her mother, then back to Arthur. Arthur's heart clenched. He saw Sarah's expression tighten, a familiar pain shadowing her eyes. "He was very talented," Sarah said, her voice a little thick. Arthur spent nearly an hour there, patiently answering Sarah's questions, reassuring her of the foundation's legitimacy. He sensed her desperation warring with her pride and distrust. He left her with an application form and his direct contact information, urging her to think about it. As he was leaving, Lily approached him, clutching a slightly crumpled drawing. Not the castle, but a new one, a portrait of a stick-figure man with wild dark hair and a kind smile. "This is for you," she whispered, thrusting it into his hand. It's like my daddy." Arthur looked at the drawing, then at Lily. The stick figure bore no real resemblance to him or anyone specific, yet the child's intention was clear. He felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's a wonderful gift." He folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Driving back to Manhattan, the city lights seemed less harsh, the usual emptiness inside him replaced by a confusing mix of hope, sorrow, and a burgeoning sense of connection. He had made contact. He was no closer to knowing the truth about Daniel Miller's resemblance to him, but he was a step closer to Lily and Sarah. He found himself looking forward to Mr. Davies' next report with an eagerness that was entirely new. He was no longer just a millionaire CEO. He was a man on a quest that felt more important than any business deal he had ever pursued. The transformation had begun, subtly but irrevocably, in a small apartment in Queens, under the watchful eyes of a little girl who saw her father in a stranger's face. The image of Lily's drawing, a child's innocent attempt to capture a memory, stayed with Arthur long after he returned to his sterile penthouse. He carefully smoothed it out and placed it on his mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the financial reports and legal documents that usually littered its surface. It was a symbol, a fragile bridge to a world he was only just beginning to comprehend. His investigation into Daniel Miller, Lily's father, intensified. Mr. Davies, true to his reputation, was meticulous. He started to feed Arthur a steady stream of information, painting a picture of a man who was, in many ways, Arthur's antithesis. Daniel Miller had been a dreamer, an artist who struggled for recognition, who valued passion over profit. He'd worked a series of odd jobs to support his family, never compromising his artistic integrity, always finding time to draw castles for his daughter and fill their small apartment with love, if not with material wealth. Davies managed to unearth a few grainy photographs of Daniel. One was a candid shot from a local art fair, Daniel standing beside a vibrant abstract canvas, a hopeful smile on his face. Another was a more formal portrait, likely from a student ID or an old application. Arthur studied them for hours, his heart pounding. The resemblance was undeniable, yet elusive. Daniel was younger, leaner, his features softer, less weathered by cynicism and power. But the set of his jaw, the intensity in his dark eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead, it was like looking at a ghost of his younger self, a version of Arthur that might have existed had he chosen a different path, had he fought for Eleanor. There was also a subtle hint of Eleanor in Daniel's face, particularly around the eyes and the curve of his smile. It was enough to deepen Arthur's conviction, to fuel the terrifying hope that was taking root in his soul. Davy's reports also delved into Daniel's background. He had been adopted as a young child after spending some time in foster care. His adoptive parents were good people, but they knew little about his biological origins. Daniel, it seemed, had spent years quietly searching for his birth parents, particularly his biological father, driven by a need to understand his own identity, a common thread in some of his more personal artworks, which often depicted themes of searching, fragmented connections, and lost heritage. Davies found evidence of letters Daniel had written to adoption agencies, of online searches for people with the surname Blackwood who might have lived in New York in the late 80s. The trail had always gone cold for him. Arthur read these details with a growing sense of anguish. His son, if Daniel was indeed his son, had been looking for him, and Arthur had been oblivious, wrapped up in his world of corporate conquests. The irony was a bitter pill. He, who could locate any business rival or track any financial transaction, had been utterly unaware of a life so intimately connected to his own. He learned about Daniel's kindness, his devotion to Sarah and Lily, the small community of artists who had admired his talent, even if the wider world had not. He sounded like a man Arthur would have liked, perhaps even envied for his authenticity and his capacity for love. This knowledge brought a complex mix of emotions: pride in the man Daniel had become, profound regret for the lost years, and a crushing guilt for his absence in Daniel's life. Arthur found himself changing. His interactions with Sarah and Lily, though initially orchestrated, began to feel less like a means to an end, and more like something he genuinely valued. He ensured the Brighter Futures grant application from Sarah was fast-tracked. He didn't just send a check. He arranged for a financial advisor from the foundation to meet with Sarah, to help her plan, to ensure the money was used wisely to provide long-term stability. He made excuses to visit Queens again, sometimes under the guise of checking on the foundation's pilot program, other times bringing small, thoughtful gifts for Lily, art supplies, books he thought Daniel might have chosen for her. He was careful not to overwhelm them, to respect Sarah's boundaries, but he was undeniably drawn to their small, warm world. He'd sit in their cozy living room, listening to Lily chatter about her day at school, observing Sarah's quiet strength. He saw how much Lily missed her father, how often she'd mention him, her memories vivid and cherished. Each mention of "my daddy" was a subtle knife twist for Arthur, a reminder of what he had lost, or perhaps never truly had. He found himself looking at Lily, searching for more traces of himself, of Eleanor. He saw his own determination in her stubborn refusal to give up on a difficult puzzle, Eleanor's artistic flair in the way she mixed colors with an intuitive grace. He started to feel a connection to this child that went beyond mere sympathy or a sense of duty. It was a pull, deep and resonant, that felt startlingly like love. This tentative, burgeoning affection for Lily and his growing respect for Sarah began to bleed into other areas of his life. The ruthlessness that had defined his career felt increasingly hollow. During one particularly aggressive negotiation for a new acquisition, he found himself thinking of Daniel's quiet integrity, of Sarah's struggle, and he pulled back, opting for a fairer, more collaborative approach. His executives were stunned. His longtime rival, initially suspicious, found himself agreeing to terms that were mutually beneficial rather than a win-at-all-costs scenario. Arthur felt a surprising sense of satisfaction from this, a lightness that had been absent from his previous victories. The solitude of his penthouse, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. He found himself lingering longer at the office, not because of work, but because going home meant confronting the silence and the ghosts of his past. He began to confide, hesitantly at first, in Grace, his assistant. She had worked for him for over 2 decades, had seen him through triumphs and personal losses, like the death of his own estranged father, always maintaining a professional yet empathetic demeanor. One late evening, as he stared at Lily's drawing on his desk, he found himself telling Grace about the little girl selling candy, about her uncanny words, about the family in Queens. He didn't reveal his deepest suspicions about Daniel's paternity yet, but he spoke of the profound impact the encounter had on him. Grace listened without judgment, her expression kind. "It sounds like they've touched something in you, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly when he finished. "Something that's been dormant for a long time." Her simple observation resonated deeply. He was changing, thawing from a self-imposed emotional winter. The quest to understand Lily's father was becoming a quest to understand himself, to reclaim a part of his humanity he thought long dead. The money, the power, the accolades, they all seemed to fade in importance compared to the fragile hope of connection, the possibility of family, however unconventional. He was on the precipice of a revelation. He could feel it, and for the first time in his adult life, Arthur Blackwood was truly, profoundly afraid, not of failure, but of the truth, and the immense, life-altering responsibility it might bring. The breakthrough came on a cold, grey morning, much like the one when he'd first encountered Lily. Mr. Davies called, his voice unusually somber. "Mr. Blackwood, I believe I found something definitive. It's delicate." Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside his panoramic office window. He gripped the receiver, his knuckles white. "Tell me, Davies. Now." Davies cleared his throat. "We managed to trace Daniel Miller's adoptive mother. She's elderly now, in a nursing home, but her memory is still sharp on certain subjects. She kept a small box of Daniel's biological mother's belongings, things that were with him when he was placed in foster care. Among them was a letter, not addressed to anyone in particular, more like a journal entry, or a letter never sent. It was written by a woman named Eleanor Vance." Arthur's breath caught in his throat. Eleanor Vance. That was her maiden name, before she briefly became Eleanor Parker when she married a young man on the rebound, a marriage that lasted less than a year, according to a much earlier, fruitless search Arthur had conducted decades ago. "What did the letter say?" Arthur managed, his voice barely a whisper. "It was written approximately 35 years ago," Davies continued, his tone careful. "In it, Eleanor Vance writes about being pregnant, about the father of her child being a young man whose family disapproved of her, a man she loved but who was forced to leave. She mentions his ambition, his father's influence. She writes of her decision to have the child and raise it alone, to change her name and move away to protect the child from what she perceived as a potentially harmful family dynamic. She named the baby Daniel." Davies paused, letting the information sink in. "The dates align, Mr. Blackwood. The descriptions, they seem to point to your past relationship with Eleanor Vance." Arthur sank into his chair, the receiver slipping from his numb fingers and clattering onto the polished desk. Daniel was his son. His son. The words echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of his office. Lily was his granddaughter. The resemblance, the little girl's innocent words, it all crashed together with the devastating force of irrefutable truth. He felt a wave of dizziness, a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow that threatened to consume him. All those years, a lifetime. His son had lived and died without knowing him, had searched for him, and he, Arthur, had been oblivious, chasing shadows of success, while the real treasure, his own flesh and blood, had been just beyond his grasp. He picked up the receiver, his hand shaking. "Davies! Eleanor! What happened to her?" According to further information we gathered linked to Daniel's early childhood records, Eleanor Vance, who later went by Eleanor Miller after a brief early marriage to a man named Miller, who was not Daniel's father, but whose name she kept, passed away from complications related to pneumonia when Daniel was about 4 years old. He was then placed into the foster care system before being adopted by the Millers who raised him. Eleanor was gone. He'd known, deep down, that she likely wasn't alive, given his inability to find her years ago. But hearing it confirmed in this context was a fresh agony. She had protected their son, given him life, and faced her own struggles alone. And he had been nowhere. The weight of his past failures, his cowardice, his misplaced priorities came crashing down on him. He wasn't just a millionaire CEO anymore. He was a failed father, a failed partner, a man who had missed the most important things in life. The grief was overwhelming, raw and suffocating. He dismissed Davies, mumbling his thanks, and then he simply sat there, staring sightlessly at the city below, as tears he hadn't shed since boyhood streamed down his face. The meticulous facade of Arthur Blackwood, the titan of industry, shattered, leaving behind a broken, grieving man. Empire, his wealth, his power, it all meant nothing. He would trade it all, every last cent, for a single moment with Daniel, for a chance to tell Eleanor he was sorry, that he had loved her. The hours that followed were a blur of pain and regret. He cancelled all his appointments, locked his office door, and allowed himself to feel the full force of his emotions. He thought of Daniel, the artist, the father, the man who had searched for him. He pictured Lily's bright, inquisitive face, her innocent declaration that had unknowingly set him on this path of discovery. She was his granddaughter, the only living link to the son he never knew, to the love he had so foolishly thrown away. A new emotion began to surface through the grief, a fierce, protective love for Lily, and a profound sense of responsibility towards her and Sarah. He had failed Daniel, but he would not fail Lily. He owed it to Daniel's memory, to Eleanor's sacrifice, and to the innocent child who carried his blood. The transformation that had been slowly taking root within him now accelerated, forged in the crucible of his grief and regret. His priorities shifted with seismic force. The world of high finance, of hostile takeovers and boardroom battles, seemed distant and irrelevant. What mattered now was family, the family he had just discovered, the family he was determined to cherish and protect. He knew he had to tell Sarah the truth. It would be difficult, painful, and there was no guarantee she would welcome him into their lives, especially given the circumstances. But Lily deserved to know her heritage, and he, Arthur, needed to try to make amends, to be the grandfather he never knew he could be. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with emotional peril, but for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Blackwood felt a sense of purpose that transcended the mere accumulation of wealth. It was a purpose rooted in love, loss, and the hope of redemption. The decision to reveal the truth to Sarah Miller weighed heavily on Arthur. He rehearsed the conversation 100 times in his mind, each scenario more fraught than the last. How do you tell a grieving widow that you are the father of the man she loved, a father who was absent his entire life? How do you explain decades of silence without sounding like a monster or a fool? He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed an anchor, someone to witness his confession and perhaps mediate the inevitable emotional fallout. He turned to Grace, his steadfast assistant, who had by now pieced together much of the story through his uncharacteristic emotional displays and veiled comments. When he finally laid out the full, unvarnished truth about Eleanor, about Daniel being his son, about Lily being his granddaughter, Grace listened with her customary quiet empathy, her eyes filled with a compassion that Arthur found immensely fortifying. "She needs to know, Mr. Blackwood," Grace said gently but firmly, "and so does Lily, eventually. But you must prepare yourself for any reaction. This is a shock, and she has every right to her anger, her grief, her confusion." Grace offered to accompany him, not as his assistant, but as a friend, a neutral presence. Arthur, immensely grateful, accepted. He arranged to meet Sarah at her apartment, explaining that he had some important information regarding Daniel and his family history that he needed to share in person. The vagueness of his request likely set Sarah on edge, but she agreed, her voice tight with apprehension over the phone. The drive to Queens with Grace was filled with a tense silence. Arthur clutched a small, worn, leather-bound journal in his hands. It was Eleanor's, the one Davy's investigator had recovered. It contained the letter, along with other poignant entries about her hopes and fears for her unborn child. He hoped it would serve as tangible proof, a testament to a love story that had ended in tragedy, but had also resulted in the miracle of Daniel, and subsequently, Lily. When Sarah opened the door, her eyes immediately flicked from Arthur to Grace, her suspicion palpable. "Mr. Blackwood, and this is Grace Holloway, a close friend and colleague," Arthur explained, his voice hoarse. "May we come in?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded, leading them into the small living room. Lily was thankfully not present. Sarah mentioned she was at a neighbor's for a playdate. The room felt charged, the air thick with unspoken questions. Arthur began, his voice trembling slightly despite his efforts to remain composed. He spoke of his youthful relationship with Eleanor Vance, of his ambitious father's interference, of their forced separation. He confessed his cowardice, his regret. Then, with a heavy heart, he told her about the letter, about his discovery that Daniel was his son. He watched Sarah's face as he spoke, saw the initial confusion morph into disbelief, then dawning horror, and finally, a wave of raw, unfiltered anger. "You're telling me," she said, her voice dangerously low, her eyes blazing, "that you are Daniel's father, that you were out there, living your wealthy life, while we struggled, while he searched for you." Her voice broke on the last word. Arthur flinched but held her gaze. "Yes," he admitted, the word tasting like ash. "I didn't know, Sarah. I swear, I didn't know until a few days ago. If I had, You what?" She shot back, standing up, her fists clenched. "You would have swooped in with your money and tried to fix everything? Daniel didn't need your money. He needed a father. He needed to know where he came from." Tears streamed down her face now, tears of anger and profound sorrow. He wondered his whole life. He felt like a piece of him was missing, and you were just gone. Arthur didn't try to defend himself. He deserved her anger, every bit of it. He simply sat there, absorbing her pain, his own grief a mirroring echo. Grace placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm, but Sarah shrugged it off, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "How could you not know?" she demanded. "Eleanor, did she not tell you?" Arthur explained about his father's machinations, about Eleanor's decision to disappear to protect Daniel. He then gently offered her Eleanor's journal. This was her journal. It explains some things, in her own words. Sarah stared at the journal as if it were a venomous snake. After a long, tense moment, she snatched it from his hand, her fingers trembling. She opened it, her eyes scanning the faded ink, her expression shifting as she read Eleanor's heartfelt words about her love for her unborn son, her dreams for his future, her pain at the separation from Arthur. The anger in Sarah's posture began to slowly deflate, replaced by a profound weariness, a deep, resonant sadness. She sank back onto the sofa, the journal falling open in her lap. "She loved him very much," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Daniel, I mean. And she loved you once." Arthur nodded, his own eyes wet. "And I loved her," he said softly. "More than I realized at the time. I was a fool, driven by things that didn't matter." There was a long silence, punctuated only by Sarah's quiet sobs. Grace offered her a tissue, and this time Sarah accepted it. "What do you want from us, Mr. Blackwood?" Sarah finally asked, her voice drained. "Now that you know?" Arthur took a deep breath. "I want to be a part of Lily's life," he said, his voice filled with a desperate sincerity. "Not as a replacement for Daniel. No one could ever replace him. But as her grandfather. I want to tell her about her father, about her grandmother Eleanor. I want to give her the connection to her past that Daniel searched for. I want to support you both, not just financially, but in any way I can. I know I don't deserve it. I know I have no right to ask. But for Lily's sake, and for Daniel's memory." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his, perhaps looking for the sincerity, the regret, the genuine desire to connect. The anger was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but it was tempered now with a dawning understanding, perhaps even a sliver of reluctant empathy for the broken man before her. I need time," she said finally. "This is too much to process. For Lily adored her father. She still talks about him every day. How would I even begin to explain this to her?" "We would do it together," Arthur offered. "Slowly, honestly, when you're ready, when she's ready." He knew this was not the end of the conversation, but a fragile, uncertain beginning. The emotional climax had been reached, the truth laid bare. Now came the difficult work of navigating the aftermath, of trying to build something new from the wreckage of the past. He left Eleanor's journal with Sarah, a tangible link to a story that was now irrevocably part of her own. As he and Grace departed, Arthur felt emotionally battered, but also strangely lighter. The heaviest secret of his life was out. The path ahead was steep and uncertain, but he was committed to walking it, one painful, hopeful step at a time. The days following the emotional revelation to Sarah were filled with a quiet tension for Arthur. He gave Sarah the space she needed, resisting the urge to call or visit, understanding that she was grappling with a truth that had upended her world. He threw himself into understanding his newfound role, reading books on child development and grandparenting, things he would have scoffed at only weeks before. He also began making subtle but significant changes in his own life, divesting from some of his more aggressive business ventures and instructing his financial team to explore more ethical and socially responsible investments. The Blackwood Foundation, under his direct guidance, expanded its Brighter Futures grant, genuinely helping numerous families, a stark contrast to its previous token philanthropy. He found a measure of solace in this, a way to channel his regret into constructive action. Grace remained a pillar of support, offering quiet counsel and practical advice. She encouraged him to be patient, to let Sarah come to terms with things in her own time. About a week later, Sarah called. Her voice was still strained, but the raw anger had subsided, replaced by a weary resignation and a hint of cautious curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood." "Arthur." She corrected herself, a significant shift. "I've been thinking, and I've read Eleanor's journal many times." There was a pause. I think Lily deserves to know about her family, all of it. Daniel would have wanted that for her." Arthur's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and trepidation. "Thank you, Sarah. I understand this isn't easy." "No, it isn't," she said bluntly. "But it's not about me, or even you. It's about Lily. She asks so many questions about her daddy, about his family. Maybe you can help answer some of them." They agreed to meet again, this time with Lily present. Arthur felt a profound sense of nervousness. How would this bright, perceptive child react to the news that the man she thought looked like her dad was, in fact, her grandfather? The meeting took place at a neutral location, a quiet corner of a local park that Lily enjoyed. Arthur arrived early, his hands clammy. When Sarah and Lily appeared, Lily ran ahead, spotting him. "Mr. Artie," she called out, a nickname she had spontaneously given him during one of his earlier visits under the foundation pretext, a name that now warmed him to his core. He knelt, and she gave him an enthusiastic hug. "Mommy says you have a surprise story for me today," Lily said, her eyes bright with anticipation. Arthur looked at Sarah over Lily's head, a silent question in his eyes. Sarah gave a small, encouraging nod. They sat on a park bench, Lily nestled between them. Arthur began slowly, his voice gentle. He talked about a young man and a young woman who had loved each other very much, a long time ago. He spoke of dreams and difficulties, of sad goodbyes. He then spoke about a brave little boy named Daniel, who grew up to be a wonderful artist and a loving father. Lily listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Like my daddy?" she asked. "Yes, Lily," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. "Exactly like your daddy, because that brave little boy was your daddy." He then explained in the simplest terms he could manage that the young man in the story, the one who had loved Daniel's mother, Eleanor, was him. "So, Lily," he concluded, his heart pounding, "that means Eleanor was your grandmother, and I am your grandfather." Lily stared at him, her mouth slightly open. The implications slowly dawned on her small face. She looked from Arthur to her mother, then back to Arthur. "So, when I said you looked like my daddy, it was because you really, really do." "Yes, sweet girl," Arthur said, his eyes misting, "because he was my son." Lily was silent for a long moment, processing. Then a slow smile spread across her face. "So I have a grandpa?" she asked, a note of wonder in her voice. "Yes, you do," Arthur confirmed, a tear escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. Lily launched herself at him, wrapping her small arms around his neck in a tight embrace. "A real grandpa," she exclaimed. Sarah watched them, tears in her own eyes, but this time they were not tears of anger, but of a complex, bitter-sweet emotion. That day marked the true beginning of their new family. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of awkwardness, of navigating past hurts and unspoken grief. Sarah still grappled with the implications of Arthur's reappearance, but she saw the genuine love he had for Lily and the joy Lily found in having a grandfather. Arthur, for his part, threw himself into the role with a gentle enthusiasm he hadn't known he possessed. He learned about Lily's favorite dinosaurs, her struggles with learning to tie her shoelaces, her dreams of becoming an astronaut. He attended her school concerts, beaming with pride from the audience. He read her bedtime stories, his voice, once used to command boardrooms, now softening to narrate tales of faraway lands and brave heroines. He shared stories of Daniel's childhood, gleaned from Eleanor's journal and his own belated research, painting a picture of the father Lily missed so dearly. He also told Lily about Eleanor, her artistic, spirited grandmother. He set up a trust fund for Lily's education and future, but he knew that his time and his love were the most valuable gifts he could offer. He helped Sarah find a more stable job that utilized her organizational skills, allowing her to pursue her own deferred dreams of going back to school part-time. He never tried to replace Daniel, but rather to honor his memory by being a constant, loving presence in his daughter's life. He learned to laugh again, genuine, heartfelt laughter, usually prompted by Lily's infectious giggles. The vast emptiness in his life began to fill, not with more possessions or accolades, but with the warmth of family, with shared moments, with love. His transformation was evident to all who knew him. His business associates saw a more compassionate, thoughtful leader. His few old friends saw a man who was finally, truly happy. Years passed. Arthur Blackwood, once the epitome of the ruthless, isolated millionaire, was now simply Grandpa Artie to a bright, happy teenager named Lily. He had semi-retired from the day-to-day running of Blackwood Industries, though he remained chairman, ensuring the company operated with a newfound sense of social responsibility. His primary focus was now his family and the Blackwood Foundation, which had become a significant force for good, genuinely changing lives, a legacy he was far prouder of than any corporate acquisition. Sarah had flourished. With Arthur's support and her own determination, she had earned her degree and started a small business, her confidence restored, her future bright. She and Arthur had developed a relationship built on mutual respect and a shared love for Lily, a unique, blended family forged from unexpected circumstances. Arthur often found himself thinking back to that cold November afternoon, to the little girl selling candy on a street corner. That single dollar he'd given her, a casual, almost dismissive gesture, had yielded a return beyond measure. Lily's 6 innocent words, "You look just like my dad," had been the catalyst for a profound transformation, shattering his gilded cage and leading him to a life rich with meaning, connection, and love. He looked out from the porch of the modest but comfortable home he'd helped Sarah and Lily move into, a home filled with laughter, art supplies, and the aroma of Sarah's baking, a stark contrast to his sterile penthouse, which he now rarely visited. Lily, a budding artist herself, was sketching in a notebook beside him, occasionally looking up to ask his opinion on a particular shade or line. Her talent was undeniable, a beautiful blend of Daniel's spirit and Eleanor's grace, with a spark that was all her own. He smiled, a genuine, contented smile that reached his eyes. The hollow echo in his chest was long gone, replaced by a warmth that radiated through his entire being. He had lost a son he never knew, but he had gained a granddaughter who was the light of his life, and in doing so, he had found himself. The journey had been painful, unexpected, and utterly transformative. Arthur Blackwood, the former millionaire whose heart had been frozen, was finally, truly at peace, his greatest wealth now measured not in dollars, but in love.